Hello and welcome to this lecture video on section 41.5 on hormonal control of osmoregulatory functions. Our objectives are to explain how hormonal cues help the kidneys synchronize the osmotic needs of the body and describe how hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, renin-angiotensin, aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and atrial natriuretic peptide help regulate waste elimination, maintain correct osmolarity, and perform other osmoregulatory functions. So first I wanted to start off with this table over here. These are all the different hormones that we are going to talk about in the coming slides, as well as where they're produced and their functions. So it's a summarized table. Let's start off talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine first. They're released by the adrenal medulla over here, from within the adrenal gland that sits atop the kidney. And if you remember, our sympathetic nervous system can stimulate this area and cause it to release these hormones. They're also known as our flight or fight hormones and are released when we are under extreme stress. During the stress, our body's energy is used to combat any danger that we may come into contact with, whether it is about to take an exam or you get into a car accident. So our kidneys want to halt the function temporarily so we can focus on the more important things. And once these hormones are released, we are going to cause a constriction of the afferent arteriole. And when we constrict, we reduce blood flow, and therefore the nephron's functioning is going to slow down and stop. This also triggers something known as our renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, or RAAS process, RAS. So let's take a look at that in figure 41.15 here. There's a lot going on this slide, so let's break it down. First, our body has this inactive molecule in our blood known as angiotensinogen, and it's made by our liver. Our kidneys are going to utilize things like our baroreceptors to recognize that there is a drop in blood pressure and we need to increase our blood pressure. And so our kidneys will secrete renin when we see low levels of blood pressure. That then is going to activate angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which is also produced in the liver. And we need an enzyme known as ACE, our angiotensin converting enzyme, to allow angiotensin 1 to convert into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to affect multiple processes in increasing our blood pressure. So its direct effects is that it is a potent vasoconstrictor. And when we vasoconstrict, it increases blood pressure. And we're going to increase cardiac output, which also is going to push an increase in blood pressure and volume. We'll also decrease glomerular filtration rate because, again, we will have constriction of that afferent arteriole, so we reduce blood flow into the glomerulus, which results in water retention. We'll also increase thirst mechanisms so that we drink more water to increase fluid in our body, which increases blood volume and in turn will increase our blood pressure. Now, indirectly, angiotensin will trigger the release of a mineralocorticoid, which is aldosterone, from our adrenal cortex. Remember that our adrenal cortex is a part of the adrenal gland, but is in the periphery. So the medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. The cortex can release aldosterone. And aldosterone will stimulate our renal tubules to reabsorb more sodium, and wherever sodium goes, water wants to go. So water will also be reabsorbed, and in that way we can increase blood volume, which in turn will increase blood pressure. The other thing that angiotensin II does is it triggers the release of ADH, our antidiuretic hormone. And if you remember, this hormone was synthesized within the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary gland when it's needed. So it's needed now, and it is released from that posterior pituitary gland, and it is going to go over into our DCT and collecting ducts in those cells and trigger a manufacturing of aquaporins. And remember that these are water channels, so they allow us to take water from the tubules and move it into our blood. That then increases our blood volume, which increases blood pressure. And it can also increase sodium reabsorption in the medulla of the kidney. Now, some of you may have heard of people taking ACE inhibitors that have high blood pressure. That makes sense because if we are inhibiting ACE, that means we cannot convert angiotensin I into angiotensin II that has this cascade effect of increasing blood pressure. So therefore, it helps to maintain or decrease their blood pressure if it was high before. The last thing I'm going to mention on this figure is ANP, which stands for our atrial natriuretic peptide. And this is made by the atrial cells within our heart and is antagonist to this angiotensin pathway. That's because it is going to decrease blood volume and pressure by increasing our glomerular filtration rate, meaning we have more blood flow into the glomerulus to be filtered, and decreasing our reabsorption of sodium by our nephrons, and inhibiting release of renin, aldosterone, and ADH. So let's take a little bit of a closer look of some of these hormones with some visuals. So we'll start off with aldosterone. Like I said, this is released from the adrenal cortex, and it's going to stimulate protein synthesis of sodium channels and our sodium-potassium pumps. So we will find within our collecting tubule and collecting duct, our aldosterone hormone travels through the blood and will find its receptor here. This is going to, like we said, increase protein synthesis of creating our sodium channels as well as our sodium-potassium pumps. You can see one here, here, and here. And if you remember, our sodium-potassium pumps will pump sodium out of the cell, but pump potassium into the cell. So these principal cells, by having these sodium channels here, are able to take the high sodium within the filtrate, funnel them into its cell, and then the sodium-potassium pump can push that sodium out and into our blood. Now, as we said before, water wants to travel where sodium is, so we have these aquaporins in here as well that can take the water from the filtrate in the tubule, funnel it through its aquaporins, and move that into the blood as well. And here is our ADH, our antidiuretic hormone. So water can't be reabsorbed within the distal convoluted tubule unless we have ADH being secreted. So here we see a visual where we are going to first be at a water deficit. So think you are dehydrated. So that means we have an increase in osmolality, our fluids are very salty, and we see a decrease within the atrial pressure. So we are going to increase angiotensin II through our mechanism we just talked about, which increases our thirst mechanisms, but it also tells the posterior pituitary gland to secrete ADH. ADH then travels over to our kidneys, inserts those aquaporins, and that is going to allow water from the tubule to move through into the cell, which then travels over to our through the aquaporins into our blood capillaries so we can reabsorb that water. And this is the ADH that was flowing through the blood and attached to the receptor here in our principal cell, telling it to go through protein synthesis and create these aquaporins to insert along the cell. And in this way, when we reabsorb water, that will decrease our osmolality and start to increase our atrial pressure. So at that point, if we were to, let's say, have an excess of water, then we don't want to secrete ADH because we don't need to reabsorb water. So we are going to stop the production of ADH, stop the secretion of ADH, and these aquaporins will eventually go away, and instead the water will stay within our filtrate here in the tubules, and we will have an increased urine output because all the water is staying in the filtrate and leaving along with our urine. And our last hormone to focus on is atrial natriuretic hormone. Sometimes this is called atrial natriuretic peptide. They are used interchangeably. And like we said before, they're secreted by our atria of the heart. When we have enough blood volume, we will feel a stretching of our atria as the blood fills the heart. But when we have a high blood volume or high blood pressure, we get an increased stretching of those atria, and the atrial natriuretic hormone is secreted. This will inhibit the secretion of renin and aldosterone, so it promotes natriuresis, which means us excreting sodium. Remember that water wants to travel wherever sodium is. So I'm just going to use this image as a visual. So if we're moving sodium from the blood and putting it into our tubule, then our water is also going to leave the blood and enter the tubule here, so it could be excreted in the urine. And so when we have lower blood volume, that leads to lower blood pressure, which is what we want. And this is why ANH is an antagonist of our angiotensin pathway.